to the first plenary lecture for Ways of Knowing. We're always very excited about this series of lectures. It's quite exciting. You never get out of the fun of college. You get to be a professor and you get to continue to go to lectures, and it's cheap fun and it's healthy. I recommend it. All right, so I'm Lori Pengelly-Drake. I'm the Director of External Scholarships and Advising. I've met many, but not all of you, and I hope you will come in soon so we can talk about opportunities that are available for you. If there's anything not going well or anything going particularly well, we always want to hear about it and see what we can do about that. Get you set up with whatever's needed. So please come on into the Honors College and keep us posted. Tonight, we have the pleasure of hearing from Professor David Sherman from the Department of Philosophy about philosophy as a way of knowing. It's a big overarching theme. It's one of the central themes of the Ways of Knowing course and has been from the beginning. So we're quite excited to hear what he has to say. I asked Professor Sherman to give this lecture for many reasons. One, I always hear about him from my philosophy students as one of their favorites, one of the best lecturers and professors. They're quite excited about his classes. But also, years ago, I taught with Dan and Judith in the humanities course, and I remember very, very clearly a lecture he gave on Descartes, which is also a part of our Ways of Knowing course, that I thought was quite fabulous, and remembered it these many years later and wanted to hear from him again on the larger theme. Give you a little background. He went to school at SUNY Buffalo and then got a PhD at the University of Texas at Austin. General research interests are in German idealism, critical theory, existential phenomenology, and political philosophy, and maybe your instructors will unpack all of those terms for you sometime soon. His teaching has been honored on campus with the Cox Award, which is for new faculty members who prove themselves to be outstanding quite early in their careers. And he's also won the Dennison Award, named for a former president, for his scholarship. He's both an excellent teacher and an excellent researcher and writer. Just very quick run through some of the selected publications. He's currently producing, it's forthcoming, Ethics and the Reach of Actually Existing Capitalist Markets. I know one of his popular courses is on Marxism, so maybe there's a good connection there. This will be forthcoming. The next document is, Can Liberal Egalitarianism Justify a Basic Income? We're detecting a theme here. Self-deception, Deception in the Way of the World. He's written on Camus, Sartre, and Adorno, The Dialectics of Subjectivity, and he's produced for the Blackwell Guide to Continental Philosophy. So that's just a selected section of his publications. We're really fortunate to have someone like David Sherman here tonight to help us understand this possibly complex subject. Philosophy is a way of knowing. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the kind words, and I have to confess no one has ever described what I do as cheap fun. That's great. And perhaps it is. This is actually a very complicated lecture. When one teaches on what they do, you get right into it and you get into the meat of the matter. But for people starting out, how does one approach the question of philosophy? And I decided to approach it in a fairly basic way, true to what I think you're doing. It's interesting. There are three professors speaking on myth, philosophy, and science. And these really are the three paradigms that have unfolded historically as ways of knowing. But of course, there are all sorts of complexities in terms of their interrelationship. And what I want to do in this lecture, among other things, is to spell out philosophy's relationship to myth, to science, both historically, in terms of perhaps the way we might make sense of it now. And then I want to talk toward the end of the lecture about the more distinctive aspects of philosophy itself. If what you want is to get into the meat of the matter, into particular philosophical issues, then I strongly encourage you to take courses in my department, which is really a first-rate department with excellent people teaching in a wide range of subjects. So, to begin, myth, philosophy, and science. Three paradigmatic forms of knowing. How do they stand in relationship to one another? Well, obviously, the first moves involve myth and philosophy, and I gather that you're doing this in your classes. So roughly 500 BC, give or take, philosophy starts to supplant mythology, and it does it in a particular sort of way. But of course, there's always an open question. What does it mean for philosophy to supplant mythology? And the argument isn't that it simply replaces mythology. This would not be fair to people who do mythology. But at least it forces it to live on in a different sort of way. And I'll talk a little bit about that momentarily. Then you get the Enlightenment. And during the Enlightenment, you have science seeming to do to philosophy what philosophy had done to myth. Namely, it starts to supplant it. Or at least, as I will argue, it forces it to live on in a different sort of way. One of the big questions today, and it's a question that philosophers deal with, is science now the privileged form of knowing? And is it the case that now really knowing properly means coming up with testable factual hypotheses, and then either verifying them or not, and when we verify them, we now know that this is something we know, and if they're not verified, we set it away? Or to put it somewhat differently, I'd like to paraphrase, or to use somewhat differently, Sigmund Freud. Freud has this wonderful line where he says that the goal of psychoanalysis is, where id was, there ego shall be. And the question is it the case now that where philosophy was, there science shall be? And the answer that I want to suggest to you is no. What I want to argue here, at least in part, is that although philosophy is sandwiched historically between myth and science, and maybe perhaps even in terms of the way in which it approaches questions, it's somehow sandwiched between myth and science, a somewhat more problematic claim. What I want to argue here, from the standpoint of a kind of disciplinary chauvinism that we all have, is that philosophy itself, in some sense, remains the ultimate form of knowing. And that this form of knowing, philosophy, makes sense of the other forms of knowing within a larger perspective. Okay, so how will I proceed? I'm going to start by offering a working description of philosophy itself. I'm then going to discuss how philosophy contrasts with mythology and with science. I'm then, after I talk about the historical and the conceptual contrast between them, I'm then going to flesh out my working description of philosophy, articulating what I take to be its distinctive contribution to the intellectual enterprise. And finally, what I want to do is lay out some of the more important branches of philosophy and maybe discuss a little bit of the area that I in particular specialize in, roughly ethics, moral political philosophy, and European philosophy, all of which will in some sense find expression in my talk tonight. So, what is this thing we call philosophy? Philosophy itself is the love of wisdom. But what it really is, because that definition is a bit vague, what it really is, at least at first blush, and then we'll spell it out a bit more later, is it's a meta-theoretical or second-order discipline. And its goal, in the broadest sense, is for us to understand how the world, and we as parts of the world, hang together in the broadest sense of the term. How does the world hang together, and what role do we play in its hanging together, and how can we make determinations given our own perspectives about how the world hangs together, given the fact that we're embodied beings coming from a very limited cognitive apparatus? These in broad outlines are what philosophy is. But of course, the proof is in the pudding, and we'll talk about that a bit more later on. So, the first move, mythology to philosophy. This occurs somewhere in the 500s BCs, and it occurs with the pre-Socratics. And the pre-Socratics were really these proto-natural philosophers who started to talk about the world in a fundamentally different sort of way. It had been the case, even I guess when the Odyssey is written, somewhere 700-800 BC, is this correct? somewhere in that neighborhood. Within the 200 years after Homer writes the Odyssey, when there are the gods and the intentions of the gods, and they manifest in the world in a particular sort of way, and the world is explained by reference to that intentionality, all of a sudden, a different set of explanations are being offered. The first pre-Socratic philosopher, Thales, everything is made of water. Now, when I teach something like that, I spend a fair bit of a class talking about everything is made of water. And of course, to you, this sounds like nonsense, you, the children of the Enlightenment. But when you make sense of this and understand what this meant, it's a revolutionary breakthrough. And it occurs during what's called the axial period, around 500 BC, when you have these breakthroughs in thought all around the world. Buddha, the Upanishads, which become part of Hinduism, Taoism. I mean, it's this remarkable flowering of humanity. And of course, in the West, that flowering of humanity is manifested in Greece, which was much larger now than Greece is today, but in that part of Europe. Now, what are the differences? What's going on here when you move from the myth or mythos to the logos, which is the way in which the ancients would speak of it? Logos for the ancients was an account. It was a reason. It was reasoning. It was explanation. And what Thales is looking to do is offer an explanation of the way the world is constituted. And this is such a breakthrough because he's no longer talking about the gods, and the gods wanted this, and the sea moves when this happened, and things are made of this for reasons that can refer back to the gods. He's talking about it as a proto-scientist. And this is a revolutionary breakthrough in the West. Now, I want to talk about a couple of ways in which myth and reason, mythos and logos, differ. But without spending too much time on it, the most important difference is myth is what is called syncretistic. It is able to accommodate all sorts of different beliefs. It's not antagonized by alternative views. It takes what it wants. It can appropriate different aspects of the world, bring it all together, and the story always hangs together. Because myth itself doesn't function on the basis of irreconcilable opposites and things of that nature, all of which suggest the reason that had not yet come into play, right? For myth, natural phenomena are explained in terms of the gods. Logic, reason, the logos, systematic, it's competitive, alternative, exclusive explanations are offered to explain phenomena, and both, when they contradict one another, cannot be right. What wins out is reason, or the force of the better argument. And to this day, in no small part, philosophy itself is defined by reason and the idea that the force of the better argument wins out. Natural phenomena now described or explained in proto-scientific terms. Intentionality falls out of the picture. Now, why would it be the case that philosophy, the logos, arises around 500 BC? There are some people who have thought about this, and there are a couple of reasons that are given, a couple of which are very interesting in terms of our current standpoint. So one of the things that's very interesting that's going on in ancient Greece is ancient Greece, you have a bunch of different city-states that come together. And the idea here is that when you have all of these different city-states coming together and having to formulate a shared perspective on what to do, what you come to recognize is you've got to persuade other people. You have people coming from different standpoints with different assumptions, and the way in which you carry the day in the assembly is through reason, it's through persuasion. It's not going to be by reference to your own rituals or your own beliefs, because everyone has their rituals and beliefs. When you move into the civic realm, it's a different sort of language, and it requires reason. This is, by the way, a lesson one would think need not be brought up today, but this is a problem, I don't want to expound upon it, that some of we moderns haven't yet learned. that when we come together from different perspectives with different assumptions, what we need to do is argue for our positions and come up with something that through the force of reason we can all get behind, not getting everything that we want. It's an alien concept for some. Okay, so democracy is one of the reasons that some speculate philosophy came about, right? You cultivate the art, the skills of persuasion and argumentation. But the second reason is arguably that there was an absence of a sacred theological text in ancient Greece as well. Now, they had plenty of rituals in ancient Greece, and of course they had plenty of gods, but in terms of a particular set of religious commitments, they were absent. And in the absence of sacred texts, it's works like Homer's that become, in some sense, a focal point for making sense of life. Now, philosophy fares well, but you all know the story, right? Ancient Greece is over on, you move through a Hellenistic period, and then philosophy begins to wane. And really, once you get to about 400 or so AD, when Rome is sacked, you move into a very, very long period, which is generally referred to as the Middle Ages, where there's more going on than I'm going to be able to suggest here. But philosophy really is in many ways on the wane, in part because a fundamental sacred text supplants it. And right, there are certainly interesting questions of argument and persuasion within the context of that text, but that text sets the parameters of what's appropriate. And under those sorts of conditions, philosophy does not fare all that well. Now, once you start with the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, you get beyond the Middle Ages, then philosophy comes back. And again, this overemphasizes there are wonderful philosophers from Aquinas, Augustine, spanning the Middle Ages. But you really get back to philosophy in the way in which it had been practiced by the ancients. You move into 15, 16, 1700s. Now, with the Enlightenment, the commitment to belief is gradually superseded by a commitment to reason, which all human beings share in common. But during the Enlightenment itself, there's this interesting sort of movement. So early in the Enlightenment, it's the case, to put it crudely, that philosophy has to defend itself, reason has to defend itself in the court of religion. So when Galileo, for example, offers up a heliocentric view of the universe, he's more or less politely told by the church that he won't do well if he doesn't recant. And of course he did. But as you start to move through the Enlightenment, this story begins to change. I mean, once you get, especially to the late 1600s, when Newton publishes his famous Principia, you've now really got a conception of the universe that's fundamentally at odds with the religious story. And this is the beginning of what many have referred to as the disenchantment of the world. A world that doesn't neatly hang together as it did within the Middle Ages, in which everything can be made sense of in terms of God. And so when you lived under the church during the Middle Ages, life might not be particularly pleasant, it might not be particularly fun. To use the words of the famous political philosopher Thomas Hobbes, although he was talking about something different, it could be nasty, brutish, and short. But then what you don't have a problem is, with respect to, is meaning. Life may be nasty, brutish, and short, but everybody knows what it's about. It's meaningful, your place within the universe can be made sense of, and everything hangs together. And again, I use that word hangs together because I started talking about philosophy as wanting the world to hang together. Because what I'm going to suggest to you is it's precisely when the world does become disenchanted, it's precisely when philosophy, or more precisely reason, science, and philosophy begin to supplant the religious worldview, that all of a sudden many fundamental problems arise that didn't exist prior to the Enlightenment, including the problem of meaning itself. And the Enlightenment in no small part represents, and philosophy in the Enlightenment represents an attempt to find meaning, to find grounds, to find justifications for institutions that previously didn't need to find grounds or justifications because it was obvious what the justification was. It was ultimately God, and God revealing His word through His divine representatives in the world. When this is called into question, it gives rise to an existential crisis for humanity in a certain sort of way. But it's precisely under these circumstances that the way is open to philosophy to try and reconfigure our position in the world, to give us meaning, to ground our institutions, to provide justifications and foundations that are now lacking since the ultimate grounding or justification, God, may or may not be there, but can no longer be appealed to, given the fact that many people are starting to move away and there are clashing views about what precisely God is telling us, insofar as part of what the Enlightenment involves is the Protestant Reformation itself, which puts, within Christianity there's a war, forgetting the war outside with Christians and others in terms of making sense of the world. So, you start to move into the 1700s and the story flips. Whereas Galileo, in Galileo's time, it was the case that philosophy had to defend itself, reason, science had to defend themselves in the court of religion. Now it's the case that religion has to defend itself in the court of reason. And so there have been famous moves, Christian apologetics and things of that nature, where all of a sudden people of faith began to try and explain how their logic how their worldview cohered with reason. And explanations would be given for miraculous events. But of course what happens is once the explanations are given, the events are no longer miraculous. Right? And this gives rise to fundamental tensions as well. Now, here's where the story between philosophy and science gets interesting. Philosophy and science early on move in lockstep. In fact, as I suggest, it's the case that the first philosophers were proto-scientists. They were naturalists who were trying to describe the way of the world. But a schism occurs between philosophy and science itself. Indeed, just as an aside, I would point out to you that the history, much of our intellectual history is the history of disciplines spinning off out of philosophy. And so the natural sciences spin off out of philosophy first, but that process has been going on continuously. Indeed, the disciplines we now call psychology and sociology didn't even exist. They were part of philosophy as little as 200 years ago. And so one of the questions we're going to ask is, well, if philosophy keeps spinning its content off such that you now have all of these specialized disciplines, what's left for philosophy? And that's really where I want to end the talk. But the point here is that the natural sciences are now starting to spin away from philosophy. And not only is it the case that they're spinning away from philosophy, but in some sense they're contradicting philosophy, which gives rise to an enormous problem. How so? Philosophy itself, and many of the philosophers writing in the 15, 16, and 1700s were humanists, and they were humanists in such a way that their humanism had sprung out of the church. All of the philosophers of that period, by the way, in some sense understood themselves as Christians. Even the great Immanuel Kant, who writing in the 1760s basically argues that we need to put our morality on the foundations of pure practical reason, was making the argument not because he wasn't a Christian, but because he feared that it would be the case that if you appeal to God, this would no longer get assent from all concerned by virtue of the Enlightenment sensibility and by virtue of different cultures coming together. And what Kant was looking to do was simply put morality, Judeo-Christian morality, on different foundations, which he's fairly clear about. But all of the great philosophers, beginning with Descartes, they all pay homage to the church. And philosophy itself sprung out of religion in a certain sense. But it becomes, right, what philosophy really was humanistic. And by humanistic here, I simply mean that it's human thoughts and ways of being that are constitutive of the world. We live in a human world. And that in particular was the ground of our ethical orientation. And so you get these wonderful humanists such as Kant and Hegel. And here's the problem. Science starts to call that into question. So, why is that? Science, cold rationality, factual, testable hypotheses. And it came to be the case that philosophy itself, which had rebelled against religion, was being rebelled against by science in turn. How many of you have ever heard of the great Russian novelist Ivan Turgenev? Disproportionately in the front rows here. Well, Turgenev wrote a novel called Fathers and Sons, which was an incredibly important novel that captures just this phenomenon. In Turgenev's novel, Turgenev is Russian, and it's interesting because Russia was way behind. They were not part of the Enlightenment at that point, and they've had a rocky relationship in terms of the Enlightenment after that as well. But basically, Turgenev represents the two positions I'm talking about here. You talk about the fathers. They read the great philosophers. They had read Kant. They had read Hegel. They knew the British empiricists. And they talk about values, and humanity is grounding our approach to the world. And then you have the sons. And in particular, one of the sons has a friend named Bazarov. And Bazarov describes himself as a nihilist. N-I-H-I-L-I-S-T. Yeah. And what nihilism is a belief in nothing. What Bazarov says to the fathers is, oh, we don't believe in any of that. We simply believe in what is useful. This is not to be confused with utilitarianism and usefulness, because it's well beyond that. What is useful? And how now do we ground ourselves and our approach to the world? This is the deep problem. This is one of the deep problems of modernity. The humanist standpoint offered up by philosophy was increasingly being crowded out by science, just as mythology had been crowded out and religion had been crowded out before that. And what you have is this phenomenon called scientism, in which science itself increasingly dominates all areas of intellectual inquiry. Now, around the time that Turgenev was writing, a little bit after, one of the great philosophers was also thinking about this problem. And my guess is you've all heard of him. Have all of you heard of Friedrich Nietzsche? Take my word, he's an important guy. So Nietzsche's writing in the 1800s, and he's the first to diagnose the problem. So, Nietzsche argues, right, what Nietzsche is now referring to, the problem of finding our own orientation, our own way of being in the world. This is a fundamental problem. We're in a world marked by homelessness, right? And in many ways, many of the German philosophers of that period of time were trying to reconcile us to the world because we were now homeless in this disenchanted world in which reason came to dominate. And Nietzsche sums up the problem in a wonderful way. He writes in his notes, what does nihilism mean? That the highest values devalue themselves. The aim is lacking. Why finds no answer. What's the idea here? And how do the highest values devalue themselves? The notion here is that when you espouse scientific rationality and a particular kind of scientific truth as the highest value, all other values lose their rational justification. Because nothing can stand up against scientific rationality. The notion here would be morals, you think this is right and this is wrong. That's simply emoting. There are no foundations, there are no justifications for the claim. And indeed, as late as the 20th century, there was a movement in Britain called emotivism, in which the philosophers basically claimed that what moral philosophy was little more than saying yay and boo. Good, yay. Bad, boo. That it was simply a matter of stating preferences because moral claims have no grounding. And the idea here is, when that's the case, everything loses its grounding, but for scientific reason itself. But that's not even true. Because the notion here is, if our highest value is scientific reason and truth understood in a particular sort of way, and all of our values are fundamentally upended by scientific reason and truth, there's no particular reason to take our valuation of scientific reason and truth seriously either. And that's what Nietzsche means when he says that the highest values devalue themselves. And so the problem here is, how do we now make sense of ourselves in an alien world? This is a problem that bedeviled many philosophers, certainly those with a value orientation, well into the 20th century. The existentialist movement was looking to respond to this problem, as well as a variety of other movements as well. How does philosophy find its grounds under these circumstances? So what I want to do now is talk a little bit about reason, and basically argue that it's by getting clear on what's going on with scientific reason and having a more expansive conception of reason that we can start to fill in the blanks about humanity regrounding itself in the world, which is an ongoing project, incidentally. So there are three forms, crudely, of reason that manifest themselves in different ways, and you get very clear on what the problems are when you see the form of reasoning that science itself privileges. So, when you deal with the ancients, reason is ends determining. You read and I know you're reading them, you read Plato and you read Aristotle. Reason has the capacity to determine the ends that we ought to be seeking. And of course, in their different ways, Plato and Aristotle very much emphasized the role of reason. You move into the Enlightenment, you now have Kant arguing in some sense that reason is an end in itself. For Kant, what we essentially are rational beings acting on pure practical reason, looking to legislate the moral law, with no admixture of what makes us the kinds of beings we are, with no admixture of our drives, desires, our inclinations, our wants, our needs. Because for Kant, that was the only way to ground a universal, absolute, and necessary morality. But that too is called into question, and for good reasons. What is the third form of reason? It's the one that is represented in no small part by scientific reason itself, and it's called instrumental rationality. What instrumental rationality reflects is the idea that reason itself is very good at determining means, but about the ends it can say nothing at all. And this gives rise to a very troubling story. I'm probably misremembering, but there's a scene in Judgment at Nuremberg, a famous movie, where the American prosecutors are sitting and they're around a bunch of prisoners. And one of the prosecutors says, "Oh my God, how could they have possibly gassed so many people?" And then there's someone standing there and he goes, "Oh, it really wasn't that difficult. You see, if you get the pipe so and you build the crematorium in a certain sort of way, you can..." Do you see the problem here? It's the failure to recognize, right? What he understood this to be was a question of instrumental rationality. And for science, science itself isn't ends determining. And certainly the great things that we get from applied science, most of all our technologies, our smartphones, and all those other, wonderful things, these themselves don't tell us what we ought to do, don't tell us the ends that we ought to pursue. The technologies don't, nor does the equipment. That's left to us. And of course, a story is told about how, in some sense, these things are the meaning of life and in a consumer society. But the fact of the matter is, if you look at our society, it's an incredibly unhappy society. It's not a particularly well-educated society. It's not a particularly happy society. In fact, by all accounts, our society is among the most unhappy societies, and yet it represents the pinnacle of this kind of scientific progress and the application of technology to make life wonderful. And so there are deep problems here. There are deep questions. And these are questions that science can't answer. These are the sorts of questions that philosophy seeks to answer. Okay? So, one more stab at instrumental rationality before I move on. You get classic examples of instrumental rationality with the great philosopher David Hume, who argued, reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions. Well, what is he saying? Whatever your passions are, your reason will figure out how to achieve them, but as to what your passions ought to be, reason has nothing to say. You move into sociology. One of the first sociologists was Max Weber, who had argued that in disenchanting the world, reason had basically stripped the world of meaning, and that now, if all we have left is instrumental rationality, then it's the case that we live in what he called the iron cage of rationality, a kind of bureaucratic rationality, which is very good in terms of achieving ends, but has nothing to say about the ends that we ought to be achieving. These are fundamental questions. And as I suggested at the start of the lecture, these are the sorts of questions that only philosophy can answer. Weber was very insightful in another way as well, and I suggested this earlier. The history of philosophy has been the history of subdisciplines spinning off from it. And again, Weber was one of the earliest sociologists, because once upon a time it was the case that sociology was called social philosophy. There was no such thing as sociology. This is as little as 200 or so years ago. And it was also the case that there was no psychology. Nietzsche was in many ways the first great psychologist. And you read Freud, Jung, and all the early psychologists, and in their different ways they become so dismayed at reading Nietzsche because they come to recognize that maybe they never really had an original thought because Nietzsche had already been there saying it. I kid you not, one of the two says almost something exactly like that. So we get these spin-offs of disciplines, a proliferation of disciplines. And in some ways this is good, right? Because what we are, we are increasingly a knowledge-based society. And knowledge is growing seemingly exponentially. It's a bit hyperbolic, but the pace of knowledge growth is unparalleled. And so if we want to get clear on the things we know, then what we've got to do is divide them into smaller and smaller areas. And what we have are specialists who become specialists in smaller and smaller areas. And in his great work on Protestantism and capitalism, Weber says, and I now quote him, "Specialists without spirit, sensualists without heart. This nullity imagines that it has attained a level of civilization never before achieved." And of course his notion is that it hasn't. So now, I want to come back to the beginning of the story. Remember the working definition I gave of philosophy, right? I said that what philosophy is, quote, a meta-theoretical or second-order discipline, and its goal, in the broadest sense, is to understand how the world, which includes us in it, hangs together. Now I hope you see why I emphasize the notion of the world hanging together. Because it's precisely in modernity, with its proliferation of specialties and more specialized forms of knowing, that we tend to produce more and more specialists without spirit, people who aren't seeing the larger picture. That's what philosophy tries to do, in some sense. It wants to look at the larger picture. So, philosophy is an attempt, in some sense, to fight against the grain of this movement toward a spiritless division of labor. And the aim of philosophy, as one great Anglo-American philosopher by the name of Wilfrid Sellars put it, is to keep your eye on the whole, right? Now, philosophy has to keep its eye on the whole, even as it itself has to, in some sense, succumb to the division of labor that it's designed to oversee. There are areas of philosophy. I have two colleagues who do the philosophy of quantum mechanics. And I listen to, and I can sort of make out some broad general philosophical problems in terms of what they're doing or philosophical questions. But as for the rest, I just take their word for it. I'm not an expert in physics, and I can't approach it. But, so what I want to suggest now is philosophy has two tasks, one of which is to see how everything hangs together. But the first task philosophy has is the one I suggested when I talked about being a second order or meta-theoretical approach to problems. So what do I mean by that? Philosophy spun off all of these different disciplines, and all of these disciplines do empirical work. They're, right, the natural sciences, the social sciences, they do empirical work. They go out and they seek to augment the knowledge we have of the natural world and the social world, and human beings as this sort of interface between the two. Philosophers then look at what these disciplines are doing and try to make sense of questions and problems in terms of their approaches, in terms of their methodologies, in ways that are different than the people in the first order disciplines do. So, for example, many physicists would make the argument that in some sense we are unproblematically moving toward greater truths with respect to the nature of the universe. Once upon a time, this was called metaphysics. And what natural science did was reject metaphysics precisely because its hypotheses were not empirically verifiable. The sciences are about empirical verifiability, right? So, you look at the history of philosophy, you look at the history of physics. During the 1800s, physics went through a period of time in which it had this wonderful theory about the nature of the universe and dealt with a problem called, action at a distance, which is a problem that the physicists were dealing with in the 1800s, roughly. And the idea was there was this thing called the ether, which in some sense is a stuff through which things occur so that there's no action at a distance problem. The theory was elegant. It was beautiful. It explained a whole bunch of things. And it was wrong. And science moves forward by looking to falsify previous hypotheses. This was the great Karl Popper. Karl Popper had said, what science is falsifying theses. So it raises questions, the philosopher raises questions. Are we really getting at the truth here? What is the nature of the enterprise? How do our methodologies and our own cognitive limitedness affect the way in which we come at the world? How should we make sense of our findings? It asks different kinds of questions. And indeed, one of the things that I find so profoundly compelling about philosophy is the fact that really the intellectual world is your playground. You can approach things, whatever you find interesting, you can approach. I'm interested in questions of the philosophy of economics. I look at the way in which economists go about doing things, and I raise questions that are not the kinds of questions they're inclined to ask doing first-level empirical work. Right? So that's one part of the story, right? We set ourselves up and we look at and we critically analyze the kinds of things people are doing in the first order disciplines. That's one part of the story. The second part of the story, and especially for those of us who do practical philosophy, which is what I do rather than theoretical philosophy, is we're concerned with figuring out how the world hangs together. And we're concerned with making sense of fundamental questions. What is this thing we call justice, freedom, equality? All of these terms roll off our tongues very easily, and we think that we unproblematically know what they are, and they all hang together beautifully. In fact, they don't hang together beautifully, not even ideally, and most of us have no clue what they really mean, right? The words are bandied about in the culture, but any good philosopher could take apart what goes on in terms of moral and political discourse in about 30 seconds here. Because you start to put these things to the test of reason. What I find compelling about ethics and practical philosophy in particular, with all deference to my colleagues who do fantastic work in theoretical philosophy, is precisely because we have to make sense of how the world hangs together, because ultimately we have to make sense of ourselves in the world. I mean, this is a problem we've had since the disenchantment of the world with the beginnings of the Enlightenment. Now that we're set adrift in the world without the comfortable foundations of God, how do we make sense of ourselves? How do we make sense of ourselves as ethical beings? And where do we begin? Philosophers generally begin with the notion of reason and practical reason. And what we look to do is cobble together ways of approaching moral questions that we believe in some sense have a kind of universal purchase with respect to humanity, but nothing more than that, because we no longer have that sort of absolute grounding that we once depended on. And so what philosophy is, and again, this is one of the things I find so exciting about it, it's open-ended. One of the things that many students, when they first take, say, an introduction to ethics course, find disconcerting is the fact that we're not going to give you an answer. And you say, well, what the hell is that worth then, right? Philosophy can't give you the answers. And in fact, you should be suspicious if anyone does give you the answers. What philosophy does is it poses the questions in the right sort of way, and it formulates different sorts of approaches to dealing with complex problems that may not be ultimately soluble, but there are better and worse answers, which, depending upon better and worse, have incredibly important consequences for human beings, both individually and collectively. So I close philosophy, this thing we call the love of wisdom, right? Wisdom itself is something practical, right? Wisdom, and now I quote a 20th century philosopher, wisdom is what you need to understand in order to live well and cope with the central problems and avoid the dangers in the predicaments human beings find themselves in. And so one of the reasons that I would urge you to take philosophy is that you will become wiser. Not just smarter, but more importantly, wiser. And what I want to suggest to you is that it's only by becoming wiser that you can become a better person. Because there's a fiction that at some core, I'm morally good, notwithstanding the fact that I don't understand the world, my place in it, the nature of ethics or morality. And this is a residue of a worldview that there's some soul that you essentially are, independent of what you have been in the world and what you have made of yourself in the world. And that strikes me as simply wrong. What it means to be wiser, to have wisdom, is to understand in its full complexity the nature of the world, both theoretically and practically, because only that enables us to determine what's feasible and not feasible for us and how we should best approach the way, that complicated idea of how best to live in the world. So, there are 5 minutes or so. Are there any questions? Anyone?
I know they have questions. It might take a minute.
Give them a chance to cogitate. Shall we dismiss?
No, they have
No, no.
questions.
No,
We know they have questions. There's one.
Yeah. I'm sorry?
Do you have a religious affiliation?
Do I have a religious affiliation? We're all born with a religious affiliation, but Yeah, but why is that important?
I was wondering what your personal beliefs are.
Does it matter? Okay. Yes.
What would you say to people who say that when you're talking about philosophy versus science, when science can't answer some deep moral question, it's just not being framed correctly?
What I would say is that's a mistaken understanding about what science is. Science itself is not intrinsically set up to answer deep moral questions. There's no way of going out there and looking for empirical verification of a moral idea. That itself is something that we have to construct ex nihilo in a certain sense, right? Where would you find it? I know where to look if I want to find the moon, and if I want to look at, I know what it means to conduct an empirical investigation of the world, and how to frame hypotheses, set up the experiment, and see whether the experiment. What experiment do we set up to determine the moral value, a moral value?
Well, I think if you look at people like Jane Goodall and people who work with really close relatives of humans, they've done a lot, they've recognized a lot of morals that are shared among hominids across species.
I think what you're raising is an interesting question, because the fact of the matter is, and I know a little bit about what you're referring to, that there have been certain sorts of experiments in the animal kingdom in which these animals engage in behaviors that appear to us to be strikingly moral. And it raises all sorts of interesting questions, including questions of evolutionary biology concerning whether, in some sense, the moral sensibility itself isn't something that's been programmed into us. But again, the idea here would be, is it the case that these animals are truly acting morally, or is it the case that they're basically acting off of their own wiring? And if the answer is going to be the latter. Human beings are the only beings, in some sense, to use a Kantian terminology, that have the ability to break with their drives, desires, and inclinations and say, maybe I ought not do this. Animals engage in behaviors, and these behaviors appear moral to us because some of them seem self-sacrificing when, for example, an animal might help another animal get out of a cage and share its food rather than take all the food for itself. And there have been some experiments along those lines that have shown they do that. But does that yet rise to the level of moral behavior? A lot of this may be what you're projecting onto it. The truth of it may be that this may be the beginnings or in some sense the biological grounds of our own moral comportment, but I still believe that our own moral comportment is qualitatively different than the comportment of those animals who seem to be engaging in the same sort of, say, altruistic behavior that we might find humans engaging in. Yeah? Good, sure. Yeah?
How do you feel about solipsism?
I'm sorry?
How do you feel about solipsism and how it relates to other philosophy?
How do I feel about solipsism? Well, the first question is, how seriously should I take this question that you're coming at me, right? I think that philosophy sometimes gives rise to certain sorts of silly questions, and questions that, in their own right, can't be refuted. At the end of the day, you're not going to get out of the problem of, what you're talking about is the problem of other minds, right? How do I know there are other minds out there? And the argument goes something like this, right? Well, I think there are other minds because I'm intimately acquainted with my mind. I know how I think about things. I look at other people, and from their behaviors, I then deduce that they too have minds, since what they are doing seems to mimic what I would do in similar circumstances, and I know I've got my mind. But at best, that's probabilistic reasoning, and you never get to other minds. I think the great Jean-Paul Sartre says it best. He says, you know what? In essence, the problem of other minds isn't whether there are other minds out there. For many of us, the problem of other minds is we can't shut them out, because they're always there looking at us, judging us, constituting the way in which we think about ourselves. And so in many ways, what someone like Sartre would do would be to turn the story around and say that this is not the problem. Now, is that a sort of knockdown, drag-out refutation of solipsism? No. But having said that, do you take it seriously? You know, look, this is the case with a whole variety, you know, skeptics, moral skeptics. You know, I've never seen a moral skeptic who gets hit over the head and has their wallet stolen and stops and thinks and says, well, I don't like that, but they think that's okay. Who's to say I'm not going to call the police? The first thing they do is they scream, stop thief, and they go get the cops. And so in some sense, when you look at how people actually behave in the world, it's more indicative of what they truly believe than these sort of false problems. Indeed, the great skeptic David Hume says at the end of his inquiry concerning human understanding, he says, you know what? Sometimes I engage these metaphysical speculations become so strained and bizarre. In essence, he says, I got to get out of my study, play billiards with the boys, and have a nice dinner. And then this seems utterly bizarre to me. And I'm not really interested in those sorts of questions. Yeah. Yes?
Since you say, I have a question about, since you said wisdom is wired to be good, would you say...
No, I didn't say wisdom is being wired to be good, but what I was answering was I was responding to him, and what I was saying is it may be that looking at animals in nature and how they behave, we may see in some sense the sort of naturalist grounding for our morality. But I also argue that we can't talk about them as moral beings in any robust sense because there are still qualitative differences.
But before, at the end of your lecture, you said you need that wisdom to be good.
Right. I did say you need wisdom to be good, yes.
So, do you think someone can have good intentions and still be a bad person?
Can someone have good intentions and still be a bad person? Well, that's a very interesting question because Kant would say absolutely not. Indeed, at the beginning of his Foundations, he says, the only unqualified good in the world is a good will. And as long as you have the intentions to bring it about, that's the end of the story. Now, there are different approaches to moral questions. And for certain sorts of outlooks, especially a kind of virtue ethics outlook that you get with someone like Aristotle, if you're a sort of bumbling buffoon that has good intentions but is constantly bringing about bad results, it's an open question at best whether you're a fine person. In fact, it's not an open question. Aristotle would find that you're not. And so part of it is, what is your own particular moral outlook? Right, there are three broad moral ethical systems. There's virtue ethics, there's deontology, there's utilitarianism. And they represent three very different approaches. Aristotle's virtue ethics is agent-based. Deontology is action-based. Actions are good or intrinsically good or bad in themselves. Consequentialism or utilitarianism, which is really the major game in town in terms of consequentialism, what matters is simply outcomes. And so the first question is, how do you judge goodness itself? And so you need to get clear on what your own sort of moral framework is. And you could look at these three, and they all have their strengths and they all have their weaknesses. And what we try to do is figure out how to get as much as we can out of these systems, none of which give these seamless answers. And as I suggested, what they are they're heuristic devices in some sense for us to try and make sense of how we should be moral beings in the world. They're not going to give ultimate answers, and you'll be dissatisfied with all three of them if you take them too far down the road. But they represent the best way of thinking about these sorts of problems. And that's what we do as philosophers. We think and we reason and we struggle with problems. And we don't give into false gods, which are easy answers, or politicians who come along holding themselves out as gods who are going to solve all problems. We recognize the complexities of the world and we struggle with them as best we can. And in order to be able to come back to your question, to be good, we have to be wise. We have to understand the world. We have to understand the way human beings are, what our place is in nature, what our place is in society, what our level of advancement is, how we ought to interact with one another. And it's only when you have this sort of understanding that you put yourself in a better position to be good. Does that answer your question? Great.
Wonderful. Let's give him another round of applause.